Sometimes I do things and I'm not even really sure why I do them. But I went to the Mises blog just so that I could see, what they are and see what their latest posts are so that I could see what the next couple of videos the stateless capitalists are going to put up. There was this very interesting piece on defending child labor. Let me give you a little bit of a critique of it. The author who wrote the blog post, Rod Rojas, actually said, when I saw this label, child labor free, honestly, it reminded me of when a waiter tells my table that he certifies that the food is MSG free. Which I think, that's not the exact words, but that's the essential meaning of it. That was a very strange comparison to make. Being told that there were no children forced into slavery to make this product gives you the same feeling as being told that there's no MSG in your food. I'm going to go ahead and assume, since they're such anti-government fanatics, that this comparison is probably in their mind. It works out to like a kind of big brother invading their lives, even if it keeps children from being exploited, which gives them the same feeling as being told there's MSG in their food. While the author never actually explains what that means, he just says that statement but doesn't explain it. I assume it's another typical Mises Institute thing. Complaining about something the government does that people want it to do. People want to be informed if there's child labor going into products because then they might not want to buy them. In fact, most probably wouldn't want to. Just like people want to know if there's MSG in their food because, well, some people are allergic to it. And if they eat it, they could have heart palpitations and even die. So I think people kind of have a right to know if that chemical's in it. But to them, it's just evil government intrusion. Probably the most insidious part about this post is the guy's altering of the definition of child labor. Child labor is, say, a 12 or 11, 13-year-old girl chained to a desk to make sneakers in Honduras, Saipan, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, whatever. Of course, in his blog post, he changes the definition of child labor to a kid working on a farm with his dad, or a parent forcing their kid to spend 10 hours a day in front of a loom, which I don't know what kind of sick human being would force a child to sit in front of a loom for 10 hours. A child can't even sit in front of a television for 10 hours. Here, specifically in the article, the author is talking about people who make rugs in Morocco and says that it should be okay for kids to do it because it's teaching them a skill and that will give them economic sovereignty. You know what might be better for children? School, education, not having to work so they don't get a lot of the psychological side effects of it. Like, I don't know, maybe they want a better life. And he's sitting there just saying that, well, the kids get to work so they learn something. Well, no, why don't you ask the kids' parents? And the kids' parents would likely tell you that they don't want their kid working at like 7 or 6 years old. They want them to be going to school so they can at least say, like in the case of a lot of Morocco, which has a really high illiteracy rate, they want them to be able to read and write. But no, sending a kid to school to be able to read and write, well, that would interfere with making rugs for some elitist a-hole like you. There's a big difference between a kid working on a farm and a kid working in a sweatshop in the third world to make sneakers for people like you. There's a huge difference. Now, I suppose you could support child labor if you completely change its definition, but essentially you're still defending putting a child to work, so it's still the same evil even if you try to change its definition. This is the line that he gives that it's okay to make children make rugs. In these little towns, it's common for teen boys to even get married. So that means child labor is okay because teenage boys are getting married in the third world. And by the way, I noticed how you used the word boy instead of girl, because if you said a teenage girl getting married, it would sound wrong. Somehow if you use a male, then it doesn't sound so bad anymore. So you're not only twisting the definition of what is child labor, you're also trying to minimize the anger or resistance that would be met with, say, arranging teenagers to get married, which suddenly it's not child labor anymore. Now it's teenage. Now it's teenage labor, I guess. He then goes on to say the only reason our children don't work is because we're wealthier. Well, I suppose if you support a system that causes mass poverty, then I guess one of the ways to survive would be having your children to work. Although, you see, we used to be like that. Then we had these things called worker struggles, where we fought to have a better life. What we did was we resisted exploitation by capitalists, not people like you, the people you pretend to be, so that our children didn't have to go to work. We never wanted our children to go to work. We wanted them to go to school and be able to learn to read and write. We fought against our children going to work because we don't want them to work. It's not because we're wealthier, it's because we fought against people like you. The blog poster then goes on to make this comparison to this Ukrainian or German immigrant family who worked as kids and then immigrated to Canada, and saying like the child labor didn't hurt them. They were happy, normal, well-adjusted people. They just lived through a war, so maybe they kind of had to. But no, it's make this ridiculous comparison. The proof of Canadian economic successes is the luxury of these children's childhood. Yeah, because they don't want their kids to be working. They don't want them to. They want them to be going to school at age 5 and 6 instead of making shit for a-holes like you. What is this supposed to prove? Yeah, by the way, the wealthy childhoods that we in Canada have is because of a socialized education system and universal health care. The things that you are against. So don't act like this economic development came around to that. These living standards, these wealthier childhoods, came from fighting people like you. Stopping the fascism that you produce. And then the guy goes on to say, economic advancement is the source of all things good. Really? Like, say, the development of the United States with, I don't know, 150 million Africans dying for its economic advancement? That's to all things good? I don't know, it was the biggest genocide in history caused by capitalism and the profit motive. Although usually you'll just say that was a long time ago, or that's not capitalism, even though it was, and there relatively was no state anyway. Never heard of that? Or maybe the 95 million Native Americans that were wiped out, part of the economic development of the settlers. Or maybe from 1947 to 1990, the economic development of India from a form of feudalism killed 120 million people. I know you just kind of tend to ignore those things and pretend they didn't happen in order to say how great capitalism is. You're full of it. His next point is that a parent doesn't put their child behind a loom for 10 hours a day out of callous greed, but out of a need to put food on the table. So what you're saying is that they're doing it out of poverty? That poverty is forcing them to do it? I mean, you said we don't do it because we're wealthier. But you always say there's no such thing as poverty being a form of coercion. And all your little cultist followers always say that. In fact, I got a couple of idiotic responses to a video saying that poverty is coercion. And they said there wasn't. Although your blog post seems to indicate that poverty was a form of coercion. Didn't really think that one through, did you? No one should be surprised that stateless capitalists or capitalists in general would defend the use of child labor. Of course, children don't stand up for themselves, don't know how to stand up for themselves, oftentimes don't know that they can stand up for themselves, they don't know their rights, and they're the people who would do anything about a right being violated because they do just what their parents tell them to, and substituting that a businessman. So, it's disgusting. This article was nothing more than a really desperate attempt to try to defend something as disgusting as child labor. Now, I noticed in this article that he never brought up anything else that has to do with child labor, like the aforementioned children chained to tables. I noticed that that just got mysteriously left out of the article. They didn't really want to deal with that aspect of it, you know, the vast majority of the aspect. They probably focused on like the 5% of all child labor in the world, you know, desperately poor families, which totally aren't coerced into anything because they're poor, but completely ignored the mass industrialization of child labor and just outright pretend that didn't happen. Ignore the tens of thousands of children who died in the U.S. as a result of child labor during the Industrial Revolution. They deliberately ignored that one too. This is typical Mises lies and bullshit. Take an indefensible, horribly sociopathic position, come up with vague generalizations about it, and then make up a bunch of half-assed excuses for it, and ignore all history of the peoples, the actual peoples of the world, struggling against it. Typical Mises Institute garbage.